Imagine for a second that you're standing dead center in the middle of this massive identity crisis.
Mm.
And I don't mean, a personal midlife crisis where you suddenly go buy a sports car or take up surfing or something.
Right, right. Not that kind of crisis.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a foundational identity crisis that threatens to just completely tear a brand new, explosive global movement apart from the inside out.
Oh, wow.
You're watching people who have literally risked their lives for this movement suddenly turning on each other over what it actually means to belong to it.
And, it's exactly that kind of internal fracture that usually destroys a movement before it even truly gets off the ground.
Yeah.
Because when a group's core identity is in question, like when they just can't agree on the fundamental boundaries of who's in and who's out, well, everything else just crumbles.
It totally does. And welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Because today we are putting ourselves right in the room during the greatest existential crisis of the early Christian church.
It really was a huge deal.
It was. So by looking at the dramatic events of the Jerusalem Council, which you'll find in Acts 15, alongside the really profound theology of Hebrews chapter 8, our mission today is to decode how the church actually survived this colossal clash.
Yeah, we're really looking at the collision between the ancient Jewish law and the radical new grace of Christ.
Right. And we're trying to understand the theological shift that ultimately resolved it all.
And I think it's important to say that we aren't just doing some dry history lesson here. I mean, we are examining the foundational architecture, like the operating system, if you will, of a believer's relationship with God today.
Right.
Because if you don't grasp the mechanics of this first century crisis, you really can't fully grasp the freedom of the new covenant that we have now.
I love that. That concept of an operating system is perfectly fitting. But before we get to the theological solution, I feel like we need to understand the ground level problem that actually sparked the explosion in the first place.
Oh, definitely. We have to set the stage.
Right, so look at Syrian Antioch. Paul and Barnabas are there, and they're seeing this massive influx of Gentile converts. I mean, non-Jewish believers are just pouring in.
Yeah, it's huge.
By all accounts, it's a staggering success story, right?
Yeah.
But then a group of men arrive from Judea, and they bring this really strict, uncompromising message.
Yeah, they really come in and shake things up.
They do. They start teaching these new converts, and they say, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved.
Right. And these men, they're often referred to historically as Judaizers, and they were drawing a really hard line in the sand.
Yeah.
They were essentially insisting that Christianity was just a sect within Judaism. Meaning, like, if you were a Gentile, you couldn't just bypass Moses to get to the Messiah, You had to become a full Jewish proselyte first. You actually had to follow the Mosaic Law.
See, I'm trying to put myself in their shoes, and I just have to ask, was this just about maintaining control, or did they genuinely believe salvation was at stake?
Oh, that's a great question.
Because, from a modern perspective, this sounds like a very specific, almost bizarre HR dispute over ancient rituals. I guess I'd compare it to updating your smartphone to a revolutionary new operating system. But a group of developers insists you still have to use the old clunky physical cables to make it work.
Yeah, exactly.
Why were they so incredibly stubborn about this, especially when they were seeing people's lives changed without the law? Weren't they seeing the miracles?
Well, we have to deeply empathize with the conservative Jewish mindset of the first century. For 1,500 years, the Old Testament taught that Israel was God's appointed agent for blessing the world.
Right, that's a long time.
A very long time. And the law wasn't just a list of arbitrary rules to them. It was the covenantal boundary marker. It was their entire framework for pleasing God.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So to a conservative Jewish believer, dropping the Mosaic Law, well, it felt like a complete denial of everything they knew to be true about God's eternal plan. They simply couldn't fathom that Gentiles could somehow share in God's favor without going through the established institutions of the nation of Israel.
Okay, so it wasn't just them being difficult or petty. To them, the law was literally the only recognized vehicle for redemption.
Exactly. That was their whole worldview.
But here's the critical tension, I think. By insisting on the law, they were fundamentally altering the gospel itself.
Yes, 100%.
Right, because if you say, Jesus saves you, but you also need to be circumcised and follow dietary laws to really be saved, then you're no longer relying on Christ alone. Grace plus something equals not grace.
That's spot on. Their demand was essentially a denial of the sufficiency of faith. Because if salvation requires your own adherence to the law, well, then the cross wasn't enough.
Right. It completely undermines the new operating system.
It does, and the argument in Antioch gets so fiercely heated that Paul and Barnabas realize they can't just solve it locally. The stakes are way too high.
So they basically escalate it to corporate.
Exactly. They pack up and take the debate straight to the top, going to the apostles and elders in Jerusalem.
Which brings us to the famous Jerusalem Council in Acts 15.
Yeah.
And, when you look at the timeline of the early church, this is actually the fourth major existential threat they've faced.
Yeah, they'd had quite a few bumps in the road already.
For sure. They'd survived administrative crises, localized hypocrisy with Ananias and Sapphira, disputes over distributing food to widows, people trying to buy spiritual power.
Right, a lot of internal drama.
But this was different. This wasn't about how to run the church. This was about who was allowed in the door and on what terms.
Because it dealt with the actual conditions for salvation. And if they get this wrong, the core message of the movement changes permanently.
Yeah.
So the council convenes, and it is just a heavyweight theological showdown. The testimonies begin, and Peter stands up.
Oh, man. Peter's speech is amazing.
It really is. He reminds the room that God gave the Holy Spirit to the Gentiles, specifically Cornelius and his household, in the exact same way he gave it to the Jews.
Yeah.
By faith alone.
Right.
He says God made no distinction between them, cleansing their hearts purely by faith.
And then Peter asks this incredibly piercing question. He looks at the room and says, "Why put God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our ancestors nor we could bear?"
Yeah, that's a powerful moment.
It is, but I'm kind of struggling with the leap he takes here, to be honest.
Oh, so?
Well, God gave that yoke, right? I mean, the law came directly from Mount Sinai. How can Peter stand there and call a divine mandate an unbearable yoke without, basically insulting God?
It's a profound question and a fair one. See, when a Gentile became a Jewish proselyte in those days, the phrase they used was that they were taking up the yoke of the kingdom of heaven.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that yoke was the entirety of the Mosaic covenant, all 613 commandments. So Peter isn't saying the law itself was evil. What he's saying is that the obligation of perfect compliance was a weight that human beings, including the absolute most devout Jews, had routinely failed to carry.
Because no one's perfect.
Exactly. It demanded absolute perfection, but gave no internal power to actually achieve it. So to force that impossible weight onto new Gentile believers, especially when God had already accepted them by faith, was, as Peter says, putting God to the test.
Okay, that makes so much sense. It was completely unnecessary for salvation, because salvation is by grace through faith plus nothing.
Right.
So then Paul and Barnabas step up, and instead of arguing deep theology, they just give like a field report.
Yes.
They just detail all the miraculous signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through their ministry.
Which is such a brilliant tactical move on their part, because signs and wonders would have deeply persuaded the Jewish audience that God was actively at work.
They couldn't really argue with the results.
Yeah. No, they couldn't. They weren't just arguing theory anymore. They were reporting on God's undeniable actions to reveal his will.
Right. And then James stands up. Now, James was the leader of the Jerusalem church, and he was known for his own really deep piety and strict adherence to the law.
Yeah, he was highly respected by the traditionalists.
Right, so if anyone was going to side with the Judaizers, you'd think it would be James.
You really would.
But James does something brilliant. He synthesizes the whole debate by looking back to the prophets. He specifically quotes Amos 9. And he points out that the prophet predicted God would rebuild the fallen tent of David so that the rest of humanity may seek the Lord, namely, all the Gentiles I have called to be my own.
Right, so James is showing them that future Gentile salvation, entirely apart from becoming Jewish proselytes, perfectly harmonizes with the Old Testament prophets.
It was in the text the whole time.
Exactly. God is visiting the Gentiles to take a people for his name. It wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the blueprint all along.
Which leads to the council's final verdict, which honestly is really a masterpiece of conflict resolution.
It is a masterclass.
They make a two-part decision. First, the theological ruling. They completely reject the necessity of the law for salvation. They fully agree with Peter, Paul, and Barnabas. Circumcision and the Mosaic Law are not required to be saved.
But then they add a second part, a very practical ruling.
Yeah, the practical side.
James proposes sending a letter to the Gentile believers, asking them to abstain from 4 specific things: food sacrificed to idols, sexual immorality, meat from strangled animals, and blood.
See, to a modern ear, that sounds wildly contradictory. I mean, we just agreed there are no rules for salvation. So why are we giving them 4 kind of random food and lifestyle rules?
Well, you have to look at the cultural context of the time. These 4 things were deeply associated with pagan temple practices and idolatry.
Okay, so it was about avoiding paganism.
Yes, but more importantly, they touch on the mechanism of ritual purity. In the first century Jewish mind, eating with a Gentile was completely taboo. It literally made a Jew ritually unclean.
Oh, wow.
So James wasn't sneaking the Mosaic Law back in through the back door to earn salvation. He was addressing a massive, immediate social problem, which was table fellowship.
Ah, I see. It's about how these 2 radically different groups are actually going to exist in the same room.
Exactly.
I think about it kind of like moving into a shared apartment. Let's say you have a roommate who is deeply personally offended by shoes being worn in the house because of, how they were raised.
Right, right.
Now, by the laws of the city, you have every right to wear your muddy shoes in your own apartment. There's no law against it. But you willingly limit your own freedom. You take your shoes off at the door, not because the law forces you to, but out of love and respect for your roommate. You just want peace in the house.
That is a really great parallel. But let's actually elevate it even further. Because in the ancient world, sharing a meal meant sharing a life. It was a profound symbol of unity.
Oh, definitely.
So by asking the Gentiles to voluntarily step away from practices that were highly offensive to Jewish sensibilities, James was making it possible for Jewish and Gentile Christians to sit at the exact same table and break bread together.
That's beautiful.
It is. They secured the truth of the gospel salvation by grace while simultaneously protecting the unity of the church. They threw out the requirement to follow the law, but they asked everyone to walk in love.
Okay, so the council makes this monumental ruling in Acts 15, and the immediate crisis is averted. But honestly, I still have a lingering, massive question about all this.
Okay, lay it on me.
I'm imagining being a devout Jew sitting in that room. The Jerusalem Council just essentially sidelined the law of Moses. On what theological grounds did they have the authority to do that?
Yeah. That's the million-dollar question.
Right. To find the bedrock for this decision, we have to shift our focus to the book of Hebrews, specifically chapter 8, because the author of Hebrews writes to a Jewish audience to explain the exact theological mechanics of why the law was no longer binding.
Yes, exactly. Hebrews 8 provides the structural blueprint for why the Jerusalem Council was absolutely right.
Yeah.
The argument starts by contrasting the earthly sanctuary in Jerusalem with the heavenly sanctuary. The text points out that Jesus is now our high priest, but he isn't serving in some earthly temple. He is serving in the true tabernacle in heaven, the one set up by God, not by human hands.
And the author calls the earthly tabernacle and the Levitical priesthood a sketch and shadow of the heavenly reality.
So
I mean, it was a staggering claim.
it really changes everything. The earthly sanctuary was only ever a model. It imperfectly corresponded to the real eternal ministry conducted in the actual presence of God.
Right.
So when Jesus entered the heavenly sanctuary, he achieved what the earthly high priests could only ever foreshadow with their endless, repetitive animal sacrifices.
But that brings me back to my earlier question about God giving a flawed system. Because the author of Hebrews explicitly says, if that first covenant had been faultless, no one would have looked for a second one.
Yeah, that's a tough verse for some people.
Did God design a faulty operating system? Like, did he actually make a mistake at Sinai?
No. The laws themselves were holy and good. The fault wasn't in the inherent righteousness of the law. The fault was in its provisional design.
Provisional, okay.
Yeah, it was never intended to be the final version. It was always meant to be a temporary tutor.
So provisional meaning it was a diagnostic tool, not a cure.
Exactly. That is the perfect way to put it. The fatal flaw of the Old Covenant was its interaction with human nature, or what the biblical writers often call the flesh.
Right, our human weakness.
The law demanded absolute righteousness, but couldn't supply the internal power to achieve it. It was like a mirror. You know, a mirror is perfect for showing you that your face is dirty, but you can't wash your face with a mirror.
Oh, wow. I love that.
Yeah. The Old Covenant showed humanity its sin, but it couldn't wash it away. That's why Jesus obtained a superior ministry. He is the mediator of a better covenant and acted on better promises.
And there's this one verse in Hebrews 8 that just hits like a hammer. It says, when he speaks of a new covenant, he makes the first obsolete. Obsolete.
It's such a strong word.
It really is. And it goes on to say, now what is growing obsolete and aging is about to disappear.
Think about the immense weight of that word for a first-century Jew. obsolete. Their entire socio-religious framework, the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices, it was all passing away.
It's hard to even imagine.
If we connect this directly back to the Judaizers at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, we see exactly why Peter and James had to be so firm.
Right.
Those men from Judea were trying to force Gentile converts into an operating system that God himself had already deemed obsolete. They were trying to violently bind people to a shadow when the reality, which is Christ himself, had already arrived.
That is a stunning paradigm shift, really. To realize that the entire monumental structure you built your religious life around was really just the scaffolding for something infinitely better.
Scaffolding is a great word for it.
So let's look at the actual mechanics of this upgrade. What are these better promises? I mean, if the old system of external rules and animal sacrifices is obsolete, what is the heart of this new covenant?
Well, to explain that, the author of Hebrews reaches back to the Old Testament, quoting the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 31, and this is really the absolute core of Hebrews 8.
Okay.
The new covenant is fundamentally different in its application. Under the Old Covenant, the laws were external. They were carved into literal stone tablets. You looked at the stone, saw the rule, and tried your hardest to obey it. And you inevitably failed because the stone couldn't change your internal desires.
Right. It was outside of you, basically just judging you.
Precisely. But in the new covenant, God says, I will put my laws in their minds and I will inscribe them on their hearts. The external becomes internal. The Holy Spirit actually takes up residence within the believer, providing not just the instruction, but the actual desire and the power to do God's will.
I think about it like the difference between driving while rigidly following turn-by-turn GPS directions versus driving in your own hometown where you've lived for 20 years.
Oh, that's a really good analogy.
Yeah, because under the old covenant, it's like the GPS. You're constantly looking down, stressed out, turn left here, stop here, don't do this. It's entirely external, and if you miss one single turn, you're lost.
And you're constantly anxious about messing up.
Exactly. But the new covenant is like living in a city for decades. The map is completely internalized. You don't need a robotic voice telling you to turn left. You just naturally know the way home. The direction is quite literally written on your heart.
That perfectly captures the shift from external regulation to internal transformation. And from this, we can distill a few ultimate, life-changing takeaways for the believer today.
Let's hear them.
First, because the law is on our hearts, we have a direct, unique relationship with God. The text in Hebrews says, they will all know me, from the least to the greatest. You don't have to go through an earthly priest or a specific temple anymore.
Right. You have direct access to the creator of the universe, no middleman required.
None at all. Second, we have absolute permanent forgiveness. Under the Old Covenant, the sacrifices had to be repeated endlessly, day after day, year after year, because they couldn't permanently remove sin. They only covered it up temporarily.
Like a Band-Aid.
Exactly. But the new covenant promise is staggering. God says, their sins I will remember no longer. The sacrifice of Christ was once for all.
I will remember no longer. Man, that is such a profound covenantal statement of grace. It means God is not keeping a hidden ledger of your forgiven failures, just waiting to use them against you later.
No, it is finished.
It is finished.
And finally, because this internal transformation has taken place, believers today must actively avoid the exact trap that those Judaizers fell into.
Right, we can't go backwards.
No. The writer of Hebrews continually warns against drifting back into dead works. We shouldn't treat our faith like an external religious checklist designed to somehow earn God's favor.
But, why is it so incredibly tempting to go back to the shadow? Because I feel like we naturally want a checklist. We want to be able to say, I did my 4 religious tasks today, I read my chapter, I went to service, therefore God owes me a good day.
Because checklists are measurable, right? And they give us a false sense of control.
Control, yeah.
Grace, on the other hand, is terrifyingly free. It requires total surrender. Reverting to a checklist is basically plugging the old heavy cables back into the new wireless phone. It's abandoning the beautiful reality to go play in the shadows.
That's such a tragic picture, really.
It is. When the Holy Spirit has transformed your heart, your obedience isn't about earning your salvation anymore. It's the natural, organic fruit of a relationship with the God you now know directly.
Wow. We have covered some truly incredible ground today. We started with a heated, movement-threatening debate in Syrian Antioch over the boundaries of salvation and the yoke of the Mosaic Law.
We really did.
And we watched the apostles and elders at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 navigate that massive crisis with such grace-filled wisdom, protecting both the absolute truth of the gospel and the social unity of the church.
And then we dug down to the theological bedrock in Hebrews 8. We discovered that the Old Covenant, with all its glory, was always meant to be a provisional sketch.
Right.
God's ultimate plan was the New Covenant, where the law isn't a weight on our backs, but a reality written on our hearts, providing total forgiveness and direct access to Him.
It truly is the ultimate upgrade to the human operating system. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've talked a lot about shadows and realities today.
We sure have.
And we saw how the early church had to go through the really agonizing process of realizing that the elaborate rules, the rituals, and the earthly temples of the Old Covenant were ultimately just a shadow meant to point them to the reality of Jesus.
Which was, a terrifying realization for them to have to let go of what they could visibly see, measure, and touch.
Exactly. So here is the question for you. How much of your own modern religious routine might just be a shadow, too? Are you clinging to external checklists, traditions, or habits that make you feel religious, but maybe lack the actual power of a transformed heart?
That's a challenging question.
Are you fiercely defending the shadow, or are you actually living in the freedom and the reality of the new covenant that God has written directly on your heart?
Because it really is the difference between merely managing your behavior and experiencing true, lasting freedom.
It really is. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the shadows, and keep exploring.